Welcome to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. Legal issues simplified through real client stories and real-world experiences. Creating simplicity in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome back to another episode of the Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd.
As a business and healthcare law firm, we meet many interesting people in various stages of their business. This season, we get to focus on the high-stakes implications of selling a business. This season's theme is The Hitchhiker's Guide to M&A. We will be guest-heavy and bring in different professionals to offer their experiences and perspective on M&A.
Yeah, and for those who don't know the vocabulary word M&A, that stands for mergers and acquisitions. It's legal jargon, yeah, we are attorneys, for buying and selling a business or buying and selling business assets. And Michael, over the 12 seasons of our podcast, we have actually covered a lot of sports.
Yeah, we're kind of competitive here,
Yeah.
and so that ends up, talking about big sports like typing and tennis and some of the lesser sports out there, like football and baseball, etc.
Okay, well, speaking of football, that's a sport that actually we haven't covered. And of course, most Americans are thinking NFL or college football, but the rest of the world, football actually is what we call soccer here in the States.
Well, to be fair, Brad, we did talk about Ted Lasso at one point. So at least we talked about a TV series that's about soccer. I'm sorry, I can't say football.
Yes, we did. And it seems like many Americans like you think football only happens maybe every 4 years or maybe when you're watching Ted Lasso, but when the World Cup is on.
Well, my kids played soccer almost year-round until like 5th grade, and then, of course, they stopped when they grew up a little bit. Does that count?
Yeah, sure. I think between audience members who's watching us on YouTube probably sees as a third person sitting here, but maybe between the three of us, we could do an entire sports podcast on our kids' sports. But we're not going to do that today. But again, for those who don't know, football is played every year with different clubs. Clubs is their version of teams all over the world, including the Premier Leagues, which are all over Europe. These clubs could be like Liverpool, or Real Madrid, or even Manchester United and FC Barcelona. Now, these clubs are valued anywhere from $4.2 billion all the way up to $5.1 billion. So these are some big-time clubs.
Brad, are you trying to talk me into buying a football club again?
Yes.
Okay, well, we don't have that kind of money,
Oh.
so it's just a dream. But where in the world are you going with this topic today?
All right. Since all these clubs are worth billions, even though we might buy one, to keep the fan base happy and attend the games and watch the games and buy their merch, what do these clubs need to do?
Well, it's really poor to ask me that question because I'm a Dallas Cowboys fan. So Jerry Jones would tell you branding and marketing is how you successfully fill the seats and sell the stuff. But I'm guessing most people would say winning. Right.
That is correct. I'm glad you got past your cowboy blockers. Yeah, it turns out that's pretty important, right? And what happens if maybe one of the clubs is getting special treatment from the referees? And prosecutors in Spain have alleged that the Soccer Club Barcelona has been paying about $8.2 million over 20 years to the vice president of the country's refereeing committee. And the same committee would assign referees to games and actually international competition. Now, of course, Barcelona says these payments are actually done by the prior presidents, and they're paid for technical reports and other stuff that other companies pay for. But the prosecutors allege that paying millions to a person involved in managing the Spanish referees is not normal.
Well, perception's not great when you see those data points. I have no idea if any laws were broken, but I guess they say perception's reality. But again, Brad, what does this have to do with today's guest?
Yeah, nothing that I know unless our guest owns stock in a Spanish company and has been receiving millions of dollars that we're not aware of. But let's just bring on today's guest, our podcast regular and partner, Jay Reyero.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. Good to be back.
Yeah, well, Jay, I guess we got to start at the very beginning. Do you own stock in a Spanish company that happens to be managing referees?
I can neither confirm nor deny that. No, but fun fact, I have actually been to Camp Nou, FC Barcelona's soccer stadium, not to watch them play, but to actually see a U2 concert. I was back, pre-kid, so it was the opening leg of their European tour. It was the 360 tour, and my wife and I flew across the country and watched U2 play in the stadium. It was magical. It was great.
I love the fact that you had to qualify. This is pre-kids, a.k.a. when I still had money.
Yeah, and I was about to say, did you really have to say pre-kids? Like, we all know.
I traveled to Europe. That's enough.
Yeah.
Well, all right. Well, thank you, Jay. Michael, before we get into today's story, maybe we can give, again, a high-level overview of the 5 phases of an M&A deal.
Well, as you know, and Jay knows, I love context. And typically during the selling season of a business, entering into an M&A transaction is kind of the goal. It's the big part of that season of your business. So when we refer to the 5 phases of an M&A deal, we're really just taking the deal timeline and breaking it down into pieces. And so the beginning phase is the letter of intent phase. You get through all that. You have your signed letter of intent. You move over to the due diligence phase. Everyone does that part, which we'll talk more about today. And then you get into the writing the documents, the definitive agreements phase. And then finally, you are ready to close. You're in the closing phase. And believe it or not, you're not done there. There's post-closing work, and that's the last phase of a M&A deal. For today's show, as I kind of alluded to, we're going to focus on due diligence and really double-click down into the importance of compliance in an M&A due diligence part of the deal.
All right, Michael, you're skipping the first phase of the M&A deal, the LOI. So, Jay, just again for context, what is an LOI?
Yeah, so LOI stands for letter of intent. People also sometimes call them term sheets or memorandum of understandings, confidentiality agreements. Basically, when someone wants to sell their business, this is going to typically be the first thing that the parties are going to negotiate and sign, the letter of intent. And it's simply structured like a letter, and it outlines the high-level, very important kind of detailed terms of a particular deal.
And Brad, if you remember, we talked about LOIs in depth in Season 7 during our Red Flags Non-Binding Letter of Intent episode. So those curious for some details, I'd encourage you to go back and listen to that episode. And we're going to, as we said, focus our attention on that second phase today.
Yeah, and that was during our Red Flag season. So those who do listen to it will hear me, I think, dinging a lot in that particular that episode that happened for our poor client in that one. But, well, many people probably want us to skip discussing the due diligence phase 2s because that just sounds so exciting. But believe it or not, audience member, it's actually very important to the overall 5 phases. And, Michael, what really, we keep saying due diligence. What is the due diligence phase?
Yeah, I mean, at its simplest level, I know we'll talk a little bit more in detail on this episode. It's you have this deal and the buyer wants to confirm that what they think they're buying, they're actually buying. Right. And so that means digging into the details of the business. That we call it the proctology exam. And we've had different terms. I know you have your own term, but it's really a laborious phase where you're digging deep.
Yeah, that's for certain. Thanks for the proctology exam. So that's our basic understanding. But Jay, I think our audience member is ready. Can we jump into today's story?
Yeah, so let's start our story. It revolves around a med spa. It's been operating for over 10 years. And today we're going to call the med spa the Aesthetic FC.
Good job, Jay. I like how you tied our opening banter into today's stories. And again, for those who don't know, FC stands for football club.
All right, so Aesthetic FC is a very successful med spa, has multiple locations. It's got a great brand and a reputation. So unsurprising, this day and age, private equity comes along and wants to buy it. And so for today's story, we're going to call them the Glazer Fund.
Oh, man, Jay, you are on a roll today. Again, audience members, since Michael loves context, we mentioned Manchester United earlier as one of the most famous football clubs out there in Europe, and it is owned by the Glazer family. And it probably would make sense. The Glazer Fund would want to get into another hot industry of aesthetics. All right, so Jay, Michael's making us skip the LOI, so I'm assuming there was a signed LOI and the deal moved to the second phase of due diligence.
Yep.
Okay, good. And as Michael was saying, due diligence really is that time that you need to, and I call it the underwear drawer moment. You're going to open up that underwear drawer. You're going to show the good, the bad, the ugly. And that's really the time in which the buyer gets to see your underwear drawer and see if you, as Michael said, is it really worth what they say? So I'm assuming that's what happened next.
Yep. So in any M&A deal, when you get to this due diligence phase, that the first step is always going to be the buyer is going to send over the seller a due diligence checklist. And this is a list of all the category of everything that the buyer wants to know exists, wants to see, wants to confirm. And so as a seller, you're already expecting this in the process. If I ever, talk with a client and they're not really sure of what the process looks like, I'll be sure to tell them what to expect because it can be a 4, 5, 6, 10-page document sometimes. But this is really where, again, as Michael mentioned, the really tedious exercise kind of starts to begin.
Yeah, and I love the fact that we're so sophisticated. We call it a due diligence checklist. We come up with anything else. All right, but Michael, for our audience, let them know what are some of the general things they see in a due diligence checklist, and what will they be asking to prove up?
I don't like getting into the details, right? I'm starting to sweat just thinking about all the specific things that go into this. But, so I'll give the general overview of what you would see in a checklist and the types of things that they're wanting to explore. Corporate documents, so they're wanting to see kind of how the corporate structure's set up and see all the backing behind that, the financials and the debt that goes with that the company has. Real estate, not just leases, but if they own any dirt, they're going to want a bunch of information in that category. Material contracts, so they're going to want to see all the contracts that the company's entered into that are quote material. And they're going to want employee-related information. Is there any litigation and all the information behind that? Something that we face in the healthcare world, they're going to have a ton of stuff about compliance and making sure the business is in order from a compliance perspective at both the state and federal level. Intellectual property, trademarks, patents, etc. You're going to have a bunch on that. They'll have tax categories, insurance, and in some businesses, even environmental-related stuff.
Yeah, and for our audience members to understand, these due diligence checklists can be anywhere from 2 to 9 pages worth of questions, and it's so much material that there are actually companies out there you can hire to help kind of process and pull information and drop it somewhere.
Yeah, and I mean, even to the point of it may have things asking that don't apply or you don't have. And so, I mean, they're going to ask for everything just to see what's out there.
Yep.
So it can sometimes be overwhelming because you're like, this doesn't apply or I don't have any of these. That's fine. They're just asking.
Yeah, good point.
All right. So in this case, we get the checklist. Aesthetic FC gets it. We look at it. Fairly standard checklist. Several pages. And Aesthetic FC was familiar with M&A, so we forward on the checklist to them. We gave them some general commentary, some general parameters, kind of some instructions to get started. And we had them begin gathering all the documents, and we had them start uploading the documents so that everyone could start reviewing what they have, start asking questions, see what's missing. Periodically, we would go in and we just kind of get an update, see what's in there, and make sure that the process was kind of moving along.
And Jay, when you're going through this process, what are some of the comments, like as you were talking about this earlier, but like, I don't know where to find that, or I didn't do that, Jay, or what? So what are the things that you going through this checklist of items? What are some of the comments you were getting back in this particular story?
Yeah, so in this particular story, what we're getting back is just it was a mess. So I'm going to go through some things that we kind of identified, and our audience, going back to our red flag days, are going to start hearing the dinging in the back of their minds. So kind of strap up. Here we go. So there were a lot of instances with third-party contracts just not existing. And we were basically told, oh, we just have some verbal contracts, or, oh, don't worry, it's a handshake deal type deal. There were a few third-party contracts that we did see and that did exist. And as we started kind of looking into them a little bit more, we found that they either required third-party consents, which if you've ever done an M&A transaction, those can sometimes derail the deal by themselves, or they contained right of first refusals, none of which at this point in time had ever been thought about, considered, or planned for. And so that was a nice surprise we were going to have to start dealing with. they had a lot of different affiliated and companies and subsidiaries, and there were transactions going back and forth between them, but there were no documentation to support that, no documentations to tie anything together. So the form and substance for the flow of funds wasn't matching. And so there were going to be a lot of questions that we knew were going to come from that. But the biggest issues going back to...
Wait, they're bigger than everything else you've described so far?
I told you, ding, ding, ding.
Okay.
So the biggest issues were the compliance issues. So in healthcare, compliance is obviously a very important consideration. And when we started asking questions about some of the things that they were providing, we were uncovering that the good faith exam on things such as cool sculpting, microneedling, IV therapy wasn't happening. So we had estheticians, RNs working understanding protocols and weren't going through the proper good faith exam process. When they were doing good faith exams on certain things, they were being done by non-licensed individuals, so there wasn't an MD, NP, or PA involved. And then we also had...
Sorry, that sounds very counterintuitive. That's you're doing a, quote, good faith exam by someone who can't do a good faith exam. But I'll let you keep going. Sorry.
They stayed at a Holiday Inn once.
Okay.
And then finally, estheticians were performing a lot of the procedures outside their scope, and which should have been done by RNs. There's a lot of reasons behind that. And so we uncovered kind of the gist of their operations, and it was just red flag after red flag after red flag that we were going to have to somehow deal with when we disclosed to the buyer.
Yeah, these are some big issues to discover at this point in time during the due diligence.
Yeah, I mean, to us, they were massive issues. We didn't know what to do, what to think, and so we started asking Aesthetic FC about them and about their compliance and what we were seeing and why there were issues, and we were actually getting pushback from them on all the issues, basically saying they weren't that big of a deal. Their reasoning was they've been doing this for 10 plus years and never had an issue, so that must have meant they were compliant, or that someone would have said something, over the last 10 years if there was a problem.
I'm having some flashbacks, by the way.
Yeah, and I'm about to say that the statement, I'm compliant because it must be all good since no one has ever told us otherwise, does not mean, or generally at least, does not mean you're compliant.
Yeah, no, you're right, Brad, and something we've heard too often. So I assume, Jay, that you disclosed these issues to the Glazer Fund, and I'm curious, how did the Glazer Fund receive these issues, and did it derail the deal?
Yeah, so like Brad said earlier, this is an underwear drawer moment. You can't get around it. You have to. There's nothing to hide. So we disclosed it, and we just have to deal with the fallout. What does that mean? Funny enough, in this case, the compliance issues actually weren't a real roadblock to getting the deal done. Because even though we were identifying all these compliance issues, at the end of the day, the Glazer Fund, all they cared about was getting the Aesthetic FC team underneath their umbrella and on their side. So they just wanted to get the deal done. And they understood the compliance issues, but it was more about the people. And so because it was about that, we were able to kind of go through the rest of the process in an uneventful manner, get the deal done. Of course, we have to deal with the compliance issues post-closing, but at the end of the day, it really didn't interrupt or cause any massive issues.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We see that sometimes, and it'd be great to kind of talk a little bit more about that. Let's go to break and unpack that a little bit more, talk about some of the lessons that we can learn from Aesthetic FC's story.
Many business owners use legal counsel as a last resort rather than as a proactive tool that can further their success. Why? For most, it's the fear of unknown legal costs. ByrdAdatto's Access Plus program makes it possible for you to get the ongoing legal assistance you need for one predictable monthly fee. That gives you unlimited phone and email access to the legal team, so you can receive feedback on legal concerns as they arise. Access Plus, a smarter, simpler way to access legal services. Find out more. Visit ByrdAdatto.com today.
Welcome back to Legal 123's of ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd, and we're still here with series regular and our partner, Jay Reyero.
Yeah, and really interesting. Our client in this story, Aesthetic FC, had an opportunity to sell to the Glazer Fund. We're talking about M&A, and a quick recap of kind of how it all went down. They get through the letter of intent. We get into due diligence, and Jay starts discovering a pretty big mess that we all, I think, were just getting a little anxious just listening to.
Definitely sweating.
Yes. And really, kind of double clicking even beyond, that list was the big list of compliance related issues. And so as the story was unfolding, we kept expecting to hear the deal derail or get delayed, and it was a little bit of a twist. What happened was that this was not a focal point for the Glacier Fund. They were really more focused on securing this team, and the deal closed. And so, Jay, you mentioned, kind of as we started the story, the biggest issue being compliance. And you certainly listed a lot of things that were problematic. How important is compliance to a potential buyer in a healthcare M&A transaction?
Yeah, I would say it's the 1A to the 1B being the financials. Over the last several years, as private equity has been coming into the aesthetic space, we've all heard straight from them how important compliance is to them when they're looking at any deal, in addition to the financials. And it becomes an even bigger deal outside the aesthetic space when we're talking about commercial payers being involved, or particularly federal programs. If you have Medicare or TRICARE involved, there are criminal and civil penalties that are triggered from a lack of compliance and can carry forward. And we've seen private equity get wrapped up into those criminal issues when they identify compliance issues and don't really take the proper steps to kind of fix them. So it's the most important thing that anybody's going to look at, and it's going to be a lot of heavy conversations throughout the due diligence phase, particularly when those questions come up. And as representing the seller on the aesthetic FC side, you have to start having really good discussions on why you did things a certain way, or why the compliance isn't that big of a deal, and it can really impact the discussions as you go forward, depending on the buyer side.
Yeah, it's all great points, and I think we've talked about this before. A lot of people, when they want to be compliant, they think compliance is black and white, and especially in the aesthetic industry, there's a lot of gray in there, and there's what we call the shades of gray, right? Except if you're going to bring, there's orange, which is illegal, which is kind of more where the federal side that Jay was referencing. But in the aesthetic industry, we're really looking at shades of gray. And as you kind of approach it, just because you approach it in one state one way, it doesn't mean it's legal in another state. And as you dive deeper, as Michael likes to say, double click down through that, you really start figuring out from a compliance perspective, what is your risk tolerance? And that we've talked about this before. Sometimes with risk, it's, you have super high risk, you're willing to jump out of an airplane, and other people have super low risk, and they're terrified about stepping out of the shower in the morning. So no matter where your risk tolerance is, that's going to drive a little bit of the compliance. Obviously, when you're working with your counsel, they're going to try to put you in the best position to actually protect your licenses and other things. But unfortunately, there's a lot of shades of gray, and that shows up in these M&A deals. And so, Michael, we referenced this earlier, going back to our red flags, non-binding letter of intent episode. That was a case where I believe we called him Beanie in our story, had a similar compliance issue, but didn't quite end up the same way in that particular show.
Yeah, and it's kind of counterintuitive, I'm guessing, for the audience right now, because we're telling a story where it all kind of worked out fine, even though there was all this compliance mess. And yet we're saying it's 1A and 1B with the financials. And even in those circumstances where they're, quote, cool with it and the deal closes, it can come back to bite you. And that's what actually ended up happening in our Benny story, although it wasn't in the story. It was a later thing. After they get through to the conclusion at the very end of the day, that deal closed. And they were somewhat similar to the Glacier Fund in the sense that they really were looking at the people and not really, kind of turning their cheek on the compliance. I mean, they don't actually turn their cheek. They just, as Jay mentioned, they go, we'll deal with it post-close and we'll get it fixed.
Right.
And they do, for the most part, try to get things cleaned up. But when, in any of these deals structurally, there's going to be kind of a earn-in type or earn-out type situation, or a look at how the company performs later that can affect part of what you get as the seller. And in this particular case, that's what came back to bite Benny when it came time to, look at the holdbacks and look at the other kind of post-closing financial terms. They ended up holding this compliance stuff against him, and he ended up, a year later not getting near the return that he thought he was going to get. And so, the buyer in that particular circumstance, it was no big deal at the time until they realized what a big deal it was to try to fix things. And really, they kind of hung their hat on that. But it was more financial performance related stuff that they were unhappy about. And then finally, we've just been through another transaction where compliance was the leading discussion point that almost caused the deal to fall apart multiple times. And so you don't know what the buyer's temperament's going to be going into it.
Jay, so what are some of the things that happen when compliance issues are identified?
Yeah, so like Michael said, I mean, you're not just going to turn your cheek and say, oh, we can just keep on going. A lot of times it's going to depend on the buyer. Does the buyer want you to fix everything before they even proceed to, closing the deal? So you have to start putting those things in. Or, hey, we'll just organically fix them as we go forward post-closing. Sometimes if the buyer is going to kind of overlay all their policies and procedures, it kind of fixes itself. But no matter what, compliance is going to be dealt with post-closing at some point. There's a lot of times some specific time frame that's going to happen. And I think more importantly, when you get to that third phase of the definitive documents, I think that's where the buyers are really going to kind of look at that compliance piece and try to either obtain maximum protection, some security, or like, in Michael Story's case, hanging their hat on the ability to kind of hold that against them should it come up.
Well, I mean, and those are all great points. So, Michael, I don't know if you had any thoughts before we kind of close it out today.
Yeah, I mean, it's when you think about as a seller compliance, I think the thing you need to think about is how important it is, and that it will come up, and it probably is actually better if it comes up in the front phase rather than after you've closed a year later. But I think the thing to understand is that buyers are humans, and so their focal point is like all of us. I mean, some of us are very people-focused people, and some of us are very process-focused people. And so the buyer that's, excited about and prioritizes team may let some things slide, and it may give you a false sense of security if you've had a practice that's got some compliance issues along the way. And then again, if you are a process based, buyer, that's the way they're wired. I mean, they're going to meet these things head on, and it's going to cause a lot of pressure and stress on the deal because they're going to want things fixed before a deal's done.
Yeah, and Jay, what are your final thoughts today?
Yeah, I mean, I think in my experience with all the M&A deals, the ones in the due diligence phase that have the most headaches, roadblocks, just it's a mess, are the ones that didn't get their house in order first. So a good strategy is know what you have, get your house in order from a compliance perspective. It'll make the entire process much smoother, and it's good to be compliant anyway. So even if the deal doesn't go through, you've set yourself up on that end at least to start operating in a more compliant way, so that in the future, all right, good, I have my house in order, and that next unsolicited offer comes in, you're ready to strike. And
when you're saying get your house in order, Jay, we're saying you're under a drawer because they're going to open that drawer. You can't throw all the junk in the closet so no one can see how messy that house is. And I think there's three things I think our audience should understand, and y'all have all done a great job explaining that there can be a compliance issue. We've seen it three different ways. Compliance issue number one is they walk because they can't figure out what's going on here, and it makes them too nervous. They'll close, but as Michael just referenced, they're closing with a lot less money going into your pocket at the end, or they're going to close and hop on for the ride and figure out how it works later. And that also kind of references your story because we've seen Jay and I had a deal where they offered a lot of money, they saw the due diligence, and before they even closed, they almost by half the actual purchase price. That was before they even had the earnouts that you were referencing. Michael, as we close out today, what are your final thoughts?
Well, you don't want to be like Barcelona trying to get compliant and like pay off your, medical board and all those sorts of things. So do compliance the right way and not, by gaming the system.
All right. Good points there. And of course, he's referencing, as we know, soccer or football. I don't know.
Soccer.
Okay. Well, audience members, that's all the time we have today. Next Wednesday, we have Ben Hernandez with SkyTail joining us as we continue on this journey of the Hitchhiker's Guide to M&A, where we turn our attentions to the financials and discuss something called QOE, and so we'll have to learn out what that means. Thanks again for joining us today, and remember, if you like this episode, please subscribe, make sure to give us a 5-star rating, and share with your friends.
You can also sign up for the ByrdAdatto newsletter by going to our website at ByrdAdatto.com.
ByrdAdatto is providing this podcast as a public service. This podcast is for educational purposes only. This podcast does not constitute legal advice, nor does it establish an attorney-client relationship. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by ByrdAdatto. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Please consult with an attorney on your legal issues.